This is how mobs work, right? Historically, like the French Revolution, like Robespierre is the one who leads the charge of the revolutionaries and is, guillotining everybody. And eventually he ends up on the guillotine. And so the question is whether or not the passions are going to run the show. You're going to be led by your passions, in which case your mind kind of comes along behind and justifies and rationalizes it. That's what Brutus is doing. I'm envious. I hate Caesar. I want to take him out. And now I need to invent reasons.
Our guest today is Dr. Joe Rigney, Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews College. Joe is one of the most underrated speakers and authors I know of, and an old hand at pulling insights from C.S. Lewis, Shakespeare, English lit, and political philosophy. Enjoy. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Glad to do it.
To start out here, you've read a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of Lewis, a lot broadly. If you're thinking about our times, is there anything that reminds you of scenarios in those stories?
Yeah, so Shakespeare is a super interesting one. He's writing in the Elizabethan era, lots of turmoil. You've got like the Queen Elizabeth, but then you get a transition to, which, that was not exactly a cakewalk of a time. Spanish wars and things like that. Spanish Armada and all that sort of stuff. And then she dies, and then you get the King James. And so a lot of political intrigue and turmoil. Shakespeare is addressing a lot of these sort of themes. And he's a really careful student of those dynamics, and is very shrewd both about individual psychology, but also sort of the group dynamics. How do societies function? So in something like Julius Caesar, for example, he really portrays kind of the envy that you might have with Brutus and Cassius are envious of Caesar. So there's this sort of personal dimension, but they're different. Cassius's envy is sort of overt. Brutus is masked behind this honor, right? I really care about honor and the kind of rationalizations that individuals can go through to be like, so under the surface, it's actually just envy, but it's couched in this sort of, I would do anything for Rome, this duty to country. But really it's just Caesar has risen and he doesn't like that. And so he can sort of start, like you start to see the kind of rationalizations he goes through. Well, if Caesar gets power, then he might do this, which means he might do that. And therefore we got to kill it in the cradle. We just got to end it because of the bad thing that might happen. Now,
sounds crazy familiar.
Yeah, this is right. Exactly. So like when you start to, and so there's this, and what's funny about it is that, when you read that play, Brutus is often, people think of him as it's called Julius Caesar, but Caesar dies halfway through. Sure. Brutus is the one who he's the one who you get the soliloquies, he's the tortured soul. So in some ways, he's kind of the hero of the story. And there's this really interesting juxtaposition where on the one hand, he has this little soliloquy where he's doing the rational, if Caesar gets power, then he might do this and he might do that. And therefore, we have to murder him. And you're like, that doesn't make sense. But we have to assassinate this guy, lest when he gets into power, he ruins everything. And you're literally, so when you say, is there anything relevant or familiar? I mean, good grief. Like this is the world we live in. But the psychological thing is, Brutus is self-deceived about this. He thinks I'm doing the noble thing. This is for the good of Rome. This is for the good of my people. This is for liberty. And he's being stoked by someone who's more overtly envious. Cassius is sort of in his ear stoking it. And Cassius knows, I need a guy like this. I can't just go after Caesar. We got to get Brutus on board. If Brutus gets on board, then we can take him out. What's interesting then is
Brutus is like the true believer in a sense.
Yes, Brutus is the true believer, and he's kind of like the moderate revolutionary in the sense of like, even after they do he doesn't really want to do it. After they assassinate, there's a sense in which he's always kind of riding the brakes. So Cassius is like much more realpolitik. Like, we need to take out Caesar, and we should probably take out Mark Antony. That's his right hand, because if you leave him, Mark Antony's dangerous. And Brutus is like, no, we need to be sacrificers, not butchers. We don't need to just kill everybody. Let's just take off the head. Antony won't be a problem. Well, Antony turns out to be Cassius is much more shrewd about how politics actually works, which is why he's able to manipulate Brutus, but is unable to take Brutus out that way. The interesting thing is, and there's this scene later after Brutus has this like self-deceived just rationalization, one of the most potent scenes I think in that play, and in maybe all of Shakespeare, is a real brief one where it's after the assassination, after Antony has stirred up the crowds and turned them back against the revolutionaries. So Cassius and Brutus were heroes for 5 minutes, but then Antony stirs up the crowd. It's the friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ear speech, sure. And stirs up the crowd to be like, Caesar's a martyr, Caesar's the greatest, these guys are evil, burn, kill, and there's riots. So there's a character named Sinna who's a poet. He happens to share a name with a guy named Sinna, who's a conspirator. So one of the conspirators is named Sinna. Sinna the poet is walking around Rome. And this crowd kind of forms around him like, hey, where are you going? Who are you? Where do you live? You know, and then starts asking questions, and he's freaked out. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I live by the Capitol. You know, are you a married man or a bachelor? And he says, I think he says, I'm a bachelor. And he's saying, oh, so you hate marriage, right? And it's like, it's literally the meme. You know, it's like, you know, I like oranges, so you're saying that bananas are terrible. Sure. And it's literally that thing. And they're just looking for a reason. Right. And he keeps, and he's like, whose side are you on? And he's like, I'm on Caesar's side. And they're like, oh, okay. And what was your name? And he's like, Sinna. And they're like, he's a conspirator. And he's like, no, I'm Sinna the poet. I'm a different guy entirely. And then they go, tear him for his bad verses. And then they rip him to shreds. And so it's this interesting thing like that. In the same way, it's like Brutus is doing this like really noble psychological wrestling, but is a rationalization for the murder. And it just unleashes, everybody's going to do this. And anything's going to be a pretext to do the violence. What can we get this guy for? What can we get Sinna for? And it's like, can we get him for being a bachelor? Maybe. Can we get him because he lives in the wrong part of town? Maybe. And they keep kind of striking out until he says his name. And then all of a sudden it's like, now we have a reason. And he's like, but no, I'm not that guy. And it's like, well, then we'll just invent another one. Like, it's the passions have to be unleashed. So when you take that kind of dynamic and then you look where we live, and it's like we live in a society that's just awash in a sea of passions. Like the passions run the show. These impulsive, instinctive, emotional reactions just run everything. And it's just like it just courses through society. Just boom, a big storm of passions, and everybody runs here and everybody runs there. So yeah, Shakespeare's incredibly relevant for identifying kind of the mechanism psychologically and socially for how it works.
How do you square both the sort of mechanical is not even necessarily the right word, but the inhuman nature of a bureaucracy, which we live in,
yeah,
with the very, very passionate society that we have? And how do those fit together?
Good. So it's interesting. Like, this is where Lewis is actually kind of helpful, because Lewis, you know, has this line in Screwtape Letters where he's like, I like bats better than bureaucrats. Like these nasty flying rodents are better than bureaucrats. Sure. And he says, you know, that most of the great evil done in modern society is not first done in the gulag or the concentration camp. He says, there you see its final result. Like, it eventually gets there.
It's the guys with the pens.
But it's the guys with, you know, at the desks with the pens, who never have to, clean shaven, never have to raise their voices. And so he's talking kind of, you know, you can picture sort of, you got Nazi Germany there, just the real clean cut, you know, buttoned up guys that are just bloodthirsty as all get out. And they just make sure everything's properly minuted, which also is interesting. There's a dovetail there with Caesar as well. So you got the violence against Caesar, he's assassinated. Then the unleashing of violence. The scene right after the Sinna the poet scene is Mark Antony and his two and Octavian and another general sitting around, and they basically have a list, and it's a list of who they're going to kill next. And so it's turned from like this, it was this tortured, do we take Caesar out, to like literally it's like, well, hey, if we're going to kill my cousin, then dude, we got to kill your brother too.
Right.
And it's very clinical. It's like, it's tit for tat. Like, okay, well, if I'm going to lose a family member, you have to as well, because that's just fair. And it's just working on the list, which is this sort of bureaucratization of the violence, which is a design. It's kind of an artificial way to channel the passions. And so Lewis thinks, you know, that's where it starts. It's minuted. Now, they can't actually ride that tornado. Right? Like, in other words, there's the lie that I think the bureaucrats believe is that we can handle this. We can manage this, but at some level, it eventually is going to spill the banks, and you're not going to be able to rein it back in. Everybody wants to be the moderate revolutionary. They want to be the Brutus who's always got their. I've got the hands on the lane, but it's like if you're feeding the dragon of passions, then eventually it spills the banks, which is why you end up, historically, like the French Revolution. And it's like Robespierre is the one who leads the charge of the revolutionaries and is, guillotining everybody. And eventually he ends up on the guillotine. Why? Because you don't get to pull that one back. So in kind of the modern, total state, on McIntyre's total state idea, he talks about the difference between foxes and lions.
Yes.
And foxes think they can tame the lions. That they need them. And so this is where, we're watching that kind of in the UK right now, where it's, there's sort of the three groups. There's sort of the native Brits who have been voting no more immigration for a long time. Brexit, we want out. We don't want this. We don't want this. And yet the governments made up of foxes are continually ignoring it. Doesn't matter if it's the Tories, doesn't matter if it's Labor, whoever's in power, it's the same policies, more or less, just is it 80 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour. And then finally, they have enough because, they get fed up with the rapes and they get fed up with all of the stuff, and they actually take to the streets. Well, now the challenge is that there's actually two groups that they're up against. One is the bureaucrats and the other is the shock troops, right? And so at the end of the day, it's going to, if there's no good way to like thread that needle. Right. And the bureaucrats think that they can somehow still manage it, but you're watching this and it's like it's a lesbian, police officer who's like, I'm monitoring all your social media, but it's like, and it's like, how far can they push it before you actually get an explosion? Right. And the explosion will end up being violence between ethnic groups. It'll be native Brits and the Muslims who've immigrated, and there's large numbers of both.
Yeah.
And so it's like, and at that point, it's like the bureaucrats.
Centuries of history of those.
Right. Yes, clashing. And it's like, at that point, the bureaucrats will be trying to manage something that is unmanageable, which is kind of like the lie, I think, of like modern society, is that we can sort of play with fire. Right. And we can stoke it, and we can stoke resentments, we can stoke envies, we can do all of we can just rearrange it to suit our needs, and that there's never a price to pay. And it's like, but at some point the bill comes due. At some point the thing explodes, and it's just, and this is what I think all feel culturally, is that like we're sitting on a powder keg, there's gas in the room, if somebody lights a match, it's just, who knows? And so there is a real, it's a precariousness, and it requires a certain kind of mindset, a certain kind of orientation to reality in order to face it. One that's not Pollyanna-ish, everything's going to be great, right. But neither is it doomsday, the sky is falling, panicky, because that just feeds the system. Like fear is a passion that just feeds that system.
What do you mean by passion, as opposed to, I suppose you're using that as, in contrast to the more modern, like emotion?
Yeah.
Word emotion.
Yeah. So passions is like kind of like the Bible word for it. There's the ancient word, the Greek philosophers, the Stoics, all of these guys kind of use this term. And it's basically, if you think of it, it's kind of like it's our impulsive and instinctive reactions, the sort of things that we share with animals. So if you think like when a rabbit sees a wolf, it doesn't have like higher order executive thinking. It doesn't have intellect that can, contemplate invisible realities. Instead, it sees it and it makes a decision. It just flees. Mm-hmm. So that kind of fight or flight thing that animals have, it's like, well, humans have that too. So if you think of it like there's like a higher, intellect and choice level. There's also this more like middle level, instinctive, impulsive. When you see something good, you want it. You see something bad, you don't want it. If you think, here's a good thing and there's something in the way, anger, right? I'm angry at the thing that's preventing me from getting the good. If you see something, if you had something and you lost it, that's sadness. So it's those impulsive, so we call them passions, because there's a sense in which you're passive in relation to them, like they just happen to you. And at the same time, you're not totally, it's not like a reflex where you hit the knee and you can't do anything. It's just your knee's going to flinch. Passions can be shepherded, stewarded, governed, guided, but they can't be like totally shut off. And so the question is whether or not the passions are going to run the show. You're going to be led by your passions, in which case your mind kind of comes along behind and justifies and rationalizes it. That's what Brutus is doing. I'm envious. I hate Caesar. I want to take him out. And now I need to invent reasons. So like Jonathan Haidt actually in some of his stuff on righteous mind really describes this using kind of modern psychological terms, where it's like, instincts come first, reasoning comes second. Where I want something, and now he can be a little bit overly emphasized, that it's just like that all reason is kind of a rationalizer and justifier of whatever we wanted to do anyway. Whereas I think a better picture is one in which we're designed by God for our minds to govern our passions. Passions are important, but they need to be governed. And so it's just, we live in a society that said, no, whatever you feel, whatever your desires are, just follow those, let those lead. Nobody can tell you that those are wrong. And so there is no governor on the passions. And so as a result, this is where like things like passions influence each other. So if you feel something very strongly, like it kind of is a bonding agent. Right. And so it pulls people together. This is how mobs work. Right. It's Doug Murray's Madness of Crowds, sure. Right? Where one person's passion pulls another person's in, and that bonds them together. And it just kind of spreads through that. And then if someone feels something strong, boom, it just like runs through the whole system as though they're almost like one big blob.
It is amazing, going back to the Caesar and Roman analogy, studying that growing up. It's like, there's these like professional mobs, or like there's this mob class that always exists. And you're like, that's crazy. That's so strange. And now, fast forward.
Yeah, right.
The same thing.
Yeah, that there actually are like, and that this, sort of, I guess that the guy in England was describing it as sort of two-tier justice, right? Your social media posts are going to get scrutinized and policed, and you're going to jail for that. But if somebody like, tears up, rips up a city block, it's like no consequences. Right. And it's the anarcho-tyranny, two-tier justice kind of system, which works when it's subtle, right? Like people will put up with a lot of that because people prefer order to chaos. But there does come a tipping point where people are like, no, and then you get the big explosion. And England probably ahead of us in this regard. But it's not like it's totally foreign even as we look at an election year and what we might be facing.
Yeah. How did we get to this point? Like what created the environment for this emotional charge and bureaucracy?
Yeah, so this is where I think the biblical picture actually does a really, like the biblical vision actually describes how it goes wrong kind of at the individual working out. So even just like early chapters of Genesis where Adam is charged to like guard the garden, protect it, keep it. He's given one sort of rule: don't eat from that tree. And then the serpent comes and is tempting him and his wife. Okay. And in that moment, you realize that there's kind of this 3-step movement that Adam goes through. The first step is a kind of abdication, where here you have this serpent who's tempting his wife and saying, hey, you won't die. Did God really say that? And is questioning the words of God, is challenging God's sovereignty over the moral order, things like that, and denying it. And then Adam is there the entire time, but silent, passive, and just kind of lets it run. So there's a kind of like abdication at the front end.
Looking the other way.
Yeah, looking the other way. He's checked out. He's just scrolling on his Twitter feed, and there's literally evil in his midst. Then but that abdication eventually leads to kind of like the big moment of choice where he has to choose. His wife decides, I'm going to eat this. And then she says she gave some to her husband. So the serpent got her, and now she's turned to him, and now he's got to make a choice. He's been passive, and now it's, do I choose God or my wife? Which in Christian terms is an idolatry. It's the choice of, worship God or worship the creature. Which would you rather have? Do you want God or do you want the creature? That's the idolatry. So you move from abdication to idolatry, and Adam chooses her, says, I'd rather have her without God than God without her. That's the choice he makes. So there's this high-handed rebellion against God, who's made him, created him, provided for him, and rules. And then The third step is when it's time to pay the piper, when God shows up and says, hey, what's going on? What's up? And Adam says, well, the woman you gave me, she did it. And now you get the blame shifting, right? So it's like, it was your responsibility. You abdicated it. Then you did the high-handed rebellion thing. And then now when it's time to actually own up and you could say, yeah, I did it. And instead he's like, well, you know, like, there's this great moment of like, there's literally 3 people on planet Earth, right? Or 3 beings. It's like, there's God, there's Adam, and there's Eve. And Adam's just like, well, I just know it's not my fault. You did it, she did it, the serpent did it, everybody's fault but mine. That's the one person who's not to blame for any of this, which is the opposite of the truth. Like, he's actually fundamentally the one who was given this responsibility, and he refused to take it. So when you have that at small levels, right? People failing to take responsibility for themselves and for their families and for whatever God has entrusted to them. When you start to multiply that, then you get where we're at, because that it's the passions are going to run the individual, and then the most this is the sort of Edwin Friedman was a rabbi, wrote in the 90s, psychologist, therapist guy, and he talked about the way that societies eventually begin to cater and accommodate and coddle the most immature and reactive members of the community, meaning the ones who are most governed by their passions set the agenda for everybody else. And everybody else is just kind of trying to like manage around them. So they walk on eggshells, don't set them off. You police the most responsible people because you're like, well, they're going to take responsibility. So like nobody... You know, when you're and that can apply to a family, it can apply to a business, it can apply to a church, and it can apply to an entire society where the people who are going to absolutely lose their minds are the ones that everybody orients around. And then there's you get more of what you subsidize, right? The incentive structures are now set. People will learn that the way to get your way is to be the most reactive. That's all, because nobody says no. Nobody has nerve. Nobody's able to say, that's not how we're going to do it around here. Right? You have to take responsibility for yourself. I'm taking responsibility for myself. You have to take responsibility for yourself. Right. The unwillingness to expect that people do that, and instead the excuse making that people make for themselves or on behalf of others. They couldn't help it because they've been historically oppressed.
Yeah.
Like that narrative, right, is one that's designed to absolve of responsibility in the present, because of past injustices and evils or whatever.
You mentioned our time being a powder keg, assuming reference to Europe as powder keg, pre-World War I. Do you think is it something that has to explode, it has to go bad, all the pressure is built up to the extent, the debt has grown to the extent that it has to have a violent conclusion, or is there a safer path?
I mean, so I think there is always is there a way out? Yes, there's a way out, but it involves repentance. Like it involves which fundamentally repentance in the Christian sense is a taking of responsibility for your actions. In this case, your evil actions, your failures. You're taking responsibility and owning it. We did that thing, and we need to be forgiven. We need to be made right, and then that's what sort of begins to restore. That's what restores families. That's what restores communities. And so repentance is going to be it's the only other way out. And oftentimes, what human societies do is they look for any other alternative except that one. It's like that, like it's when it finally gets to well, I guess we just have to admit that we were wrong. like that's where you have to get to, because otherwise it's just, you're just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You're not actually addressing the fundamental root of the problem, which is that human beings want to be God. They want to run things. And when you get turned upside, men get turned upside down. So it's meant to be God rules over your mind, and your mind rules over your passions. And instead we reject God, and then it just flips, and the passions run the show and mind follows after. And it's like you have to get put right side up again. And so you need people who actually acknowledge that there's someone who made them, someone who acknowledge God, acknowledge Christ, and then in repentance seek to live well-ordered lives for themselves. And then that forms, it's like what it does is it kind of forms a different kind of nucleus so if a dysfunctional society is basically put at the core, the most reactive and immature, everybody just orients around them. The first person to take responsibility for themselves, right, can start to form the nucleus of a different kind of society, right? One in which I'm taking responsibility for me and what's been entrusted to me. So if like I'm a husband, I'm been entrusted with a family and I'm taking responsibility for what happens in my family. If I'm a business owner, this is mine and I'm taking responsibility for what happens. I don't pass the buck. I don't blame shift. I own it. Even if somebody down in my company is the one who, they blew it. Okay. But well, I hired them. And so you can on the one hand say, yep, that was your fault, but it's also my fault. Like I'm responsible for your failure. That sort of thing begins to form a different kind of community that's actually like, it's well ordered. So I'm me and you're you, and yet we can be connected to each other because we're both taking responsibility for what's ours. What happens in the dysfunctional is it just becomes one big blob. Like it's a fusion where like I lose myself in your feelings, you lose yourself in my feelings, and just feelings, passions. Last night in the interview with, when Elon was talking to Trump, they came up, he was talking about empathy and this sort of shallow empathy that's misdirected. It's the criminal we need to empathize with the criminal and society be damned. And he's like, this is absolutely backwards. And it's right, because it's a pathologizing of a good human impulse to have compassion for those who are hurting. But instead, it's become untethered, ungoverned. It's not guided by what's good for everyone, what's good for society, what's faithful to God. It's not guided by that at all. It's just in the moment, what's going to cause the least amount of personal pain to me. It's actually like there's a way in which the modern notion of empathy is a fundamentally selfish endeavor, because I can't handle this person's pain. Like their pain is so distressing to me that I will just do whatever they want. Right. And so it's like,
the lazy way out.
It's the lazy way out. Right. It's, so I always joke that, there's a story in the Bible where it's the Aaron and golden calf story. And in the story, God's given them the law and said, worship me only. Moses goes up on the mountains. He's gone. And Aaron's left in charge of these people, and these people have been put through the ringer. Like they have been, they were slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. They just went through like 10 traumatic, like plagues, blood and flies and darkness and death. They had to put blood on their doorposts in order to protect themselves from the death angel. And so then they got surrounded at the Red Sea, and there's no way out. And then God literally parts the sea through Moses. Like Moses is the one who puts his arms up and they find a path through. He's gone now. This people is super distressed. They're anxious. They're nervous. What happened to Moses? We don't know. We're scared. We're in the desert. Right. We're vulnerable. Like this is like classic, like these people have been traumatized.
Right. And they've been slaves their
whole lives. So there's this history of what do you expect from them? And they come to Aaron and they say, we don't know what happened to Moses. We need gods to go before us. We need somebody to protect us. That's what they want. They want somebody to protect us. And so what I would say is, and Aaron gives in, right? He says, bring me your gold. He fashions a golden calf and says, let's worship this. And so what I would say is Aaron is the most empathetic leader in the Bible, right? He finds the distress.
He understands them. He gets
Yeah. He's like, I get you. Like, right. I get it. Like, and I feel your pain. And I'm going to join you in that pain, and I'm going to do whatever you want out of that distress. I find your distress so intolerable that I will do the unthinkable. I will do the one thing that we've been told we must not do, which is worship false gods. And so I will do that thing because I've put your feelings in my driver's seat. And then this is the classic story. This is why these sort of stories pop up in the scriptures. This is the pattern, is that when God sees what's happening and he says, hey, that people, they're doing the thing. Their worship, and Moses comes down the mountain and he's like, what are you guys doing? And Aaron goes, the people.
Yeah.
I was just standing here, right? I just threw the gold in the fire, out popped a calf. But that's literally what he says is he's like, I was just standing here and I took the gold, I tossed it in, and then boom, golden calf. I don't even know. And it's like, it's clear. This is just excuse making, blame shifting. Sure. The people. This is how they always are. It's the same blame others. And particularly for leaders, it's blame the body. It's like you're the head, and here's the body that you're in charge of. It's when the head blames the body,
right?
And says, so this is the trap. Is on the one hand, the head abdicates and does whatever the body wants, right? The people wanted it, people get it. In happy wife, happy life, right? Just like I'm gonna let let her run the show, and then when it's time to You know, it's like, well, I just did what she wanted, and so I'm going to blame her for what happened. It's all her fault. It's like, well, who is the head, right? This is in a church. It's when a pastor blames his congregation for all the problems. It's like, well, who did God put in charge here? It's in a company, right? Who's in charge of this thing? Who's responsible for it? And it's like, we abdicate, we fail, and then we blame.
Well, so connecting it to a place you used to live in, you're in Idaho now, but you used to live in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Tim Walz now is the VP pick for Kamala Harris.
Yep.
And we live in this bizarre time where he was the head of the city. Like, forget who, because some people say, well, Trump was president. Forget Trump. He was responsible for Minneapolis. Right. And it burned under his watch. But now, in our crazy system, he gets promoted to be the VP instead of canned and forgotten and the salt
in a healthy society, that failure would be a disqualification, right? In our society, it's actually it shows his empathy, right? Like he was, you know, I think that, and I think
and everything about him is sort of empathetic. It literally in Minnesota, he's passing the insane transgender laws. He's passing, he's letting people burn cities. All because he gets, you know, I get what you're going through. I get what you're going through.
The feelings of this mentally ill individual, we must reorder society around it and make a good bit of money doing it, right? Like there's always that, like, it's like empathy in some ways is part of the picture. And it's also like, it's, you know, this surgery is going to cost a lot of money and make a lot of people really, really rich. So he's going to accommodate that. When it comes to things like the abortion debate, abortion is a great example of a sort of a battle of empathies, because it's the focus is always on, here's this woman in a desperate situation. Don't you feel bad for her? And don't you want to do whatever she wants? The thing that gets lost in that, it's myopic. It's like her suffering gets front loaded as the justification. And it's like, what about the baby? What about the unborn child? And in some ways the pro-life movement has recognized this. And a lot of the stuff where it's, hey, let's look at ultrasounds, is basically an attempt to make the unborn child an object of compassion. Like, this is a human being. Do you see the human being? Do you have compassion here too? Because once you have compassion for, say, the mother and the baby, now you've got to find a solution that's a good for both, as opposed to not human and therefore whatever she wants, she gets. But again, it's catered to that. It's, you know, the riots are the voice of the unheard, right? Unless you're in England and it's a bunch of Brits objecting to rape, like then riots are just, you know, rebellion and must be squashed. So all that entire mindset of, again, catering to the most reactive, unstable, immature, passions-driven people is like the qualification for leadership in a large portion of this country. And it's like, so that's why you get the promotion. Oh, he'll do great, because that's,
if the job is have empathy.
If the job is have empathy, and if the job is accommodate to the mob,
then he is
your man. He is your man. He is very good at that.
What were those mobs like, or what was that time like? 2020. You were living in the cities at that time. I wasn't living there. I think you were living there.
I moved there in 2021.
Okay.
So I came in after after George Floyd was killed. But then when I was there through the Chauvin trials and all that stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, so it was an interesting thing. It was providential at one level. So when, you know, in the middle of COVID, our kids were doing Zoom school, because everybody was doing Zoom school for that spring. And we realized, all of us, and everything was kind of closing down, and we realized that we have family in Texas. And so Texas was more open in May of that year. And so we were like, you know, if we're just doing Zoom school, we can do Zoom school from Texas and actually go to the grocery store. And so we just decided to go, and baseball had been canceled. Everything had been canceled. So we're like, we're going to go down and just spend time with the family. So we were down in Texas when Floyd happened, and we were supposed to come back, and we were like, well, we just delayed our trip because we're watching the news, and we're like, that's a couple blocks from our house. Like, that's, you know, the shooting was a mile or so from it. And it's like and so we had friends actually who lived closer to where all of the riots and the burning, the precinct was, and all the shops that were burned. They lived closer, so we let them use our house. And so we're watching a lot of it. And then it was kind of the aftermath when you realize, like, oh, like, no one is going to be held responsible for any of this. Like, or the only person who's going to be held responsible is that cop. Like he's the scapegoat. Like
it was the most like Gerardian.
Yeah, it was a total Gerardian moment when you're like all of this stuff happens.
I said when George Floyd was killed, he died of an overdose.
Yeah,
he was not killed.
Yeah, but it's like Chauvin is going to be we're going to put all the blame on this guy and maybe these other three who kind of were bystanders, who let it happen or whatever. Who didn't stop him. And it's like that's going to be we'll call that justice. And it's like now at this point you're like, man, I don't have a clue. Like there's like major questions at the very least about how all of that went down. But the interesting thing is like the people who are actually in charge, right? The mayor, the governor, there's no consequences for them, right? And so, and if you have a society like that, people learn that's the incentive structure. And so and then this is kind of the tension that I think a lot of conservatives feel is there's sort of this nominal structure that we think we're supposed to, that we want to live under in principle, right? Like we're, fairness and justice and laws are equally applied. Like that's what we want, is that society. And yet it's manifestly the case that we don't live in that society, right? That there is different tiers of justice that this is the Vance line that he said about Walz and Harris, which is like Walz let the city burn and then Harris bailed them out. Right? But the folks that did get arrested, she's raising money in order to get them out of jail. And it's like, that's the package. And it's like, if you want that, if that's the kind of society you want to live in, it will be one that will be much more violent. It will be much more driven by passions. It will be much more demented in terms of sexual ideologies. And it will not be the sort of one that and people will eventually like vote with their feet until they can't do that anymore, until there's nowhere else to go.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, it's still all done legally. That's the thing that conservatives seem to struggle with, is that if you bail somebody out, it's like you're checking the boxes.
Yeah,
like, I did it by the book. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
And so, rule of law, you're just holding on, say, well, just follow the rules.
Right.
Well, if the rules that got you here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, what good are your rules?
What do you think about? How do you think about building institutions versus retaking and rehabbing? You've been kind of involved in larger institutions and in NSA. Like, how do you think about which to put effort into and how each of those work?
Yeah, so I think this is where kind of Doug Wilson has talked about his principle he got from his dad from military of like strategic and feasible. So I do think that there are strategic and feasible sort of legacy institutions that would be worth a fight over. Okay. And it's not like, but it does need to be the sort of thing where there is I don't want to put it as like a reasonable prospect of success, but it needs to be something more than like a snowball's chance in hell. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the reason I say that is because, we do live in God's world and God loves that kind of story, the story where it looks impossible and yet there it was. Right. Mm-hmm. And so you don't want to write something off simply because it's tipped over 51% versus 49. Right. You don't give up. You don't quit then. Right. So there is a place for that. I do think, though, that a large part of our efforts ought to be in sort of, building alternative institutions that are resilient, anti-fragile, that know how to, that can operate in a world of hostility. In what Aaron Renn's called negative world, where, for example, for Christians in particular, there's a your views, your perspectives are not simply weird like they were 50 years ago. Conservative Christians were the weird ones. You actually believe a guy rose from the dead. That's weird. Now it's you believe that men are men and women are women, and that
that's illegal.
That how dare you? Yeah. It's like there's a hostility to it. And so in that kind of society, there needs to be a kind of build and fight mentality. This is one of the reasons I love working at New St. Andrews, is that the mentality is build and fight. And so there's a certain type of person that just wants to build, right? But they want to build in like 70-degree weather with no, there's not a cloud in the sky. They're far away from any dangers, and it's like they want to build this nice, pristine thing. And it's like, that's not the world you live in. You live in a world of dangers, of hostiles, of harassment. The storms are going to come. Is the building going to stand when the storm comes, when the marauders come? And so there needs to be a fight mentality. And then there's another type of person who just wants to fight. And it's like, and so they can be terminally online, and they love mixing it up on social media, and they think of that as sort of like, I'm doing my part, but they're not actually involved in building anything substantive. And that's a different kind of ditch to fall into. And it's like, you want to be building something like, Chesterton has this great quote, is that in God's world, order exists for the same reason that walls exist around a city, so that good things can happen inside. So like, order exists to let good things run wild. So you put the walls up so that life can happen inside the city. So it's like, there's certain kind of guys who want to man the ramparts, but do they want life in the city? Or would they be, or if it was a prison, would they be just as happy because they get to fight, right? And it's like, no, you want to build something where your family, your kids, your community can have a kind of vibrancy and vitality, can live faithfully before God, can worship Him, can live their vocations, do all that sort of stuff. But that in order to have that kind of society, you do have to have guys on the walls, guys who are and this is all, we're using military, fight language, but it's like, there's rhetorical battle, there's institutional recognition. How do institutions get hijacked? How do they get steered? And developing antibodies so that those mechanisms don't work on your people, on you. So one of the images that I use a lot since my book came out on emotional sabotage is of steering wheels, like learning to recognize where are your potential steering wheels. Like people have steering wheels on their back, and other people get really adept at realizing, I know how to steer you. I know the thing to say that will get you to do the thing I want you to do. So it could be, they could steer you with slander, right? If I call you this name, that is so unpleasant to you that you will jump through any hoop that I put in front of you in order to prove you're not that thing I just called you. And if you're that kind of person, right, if you care about that reputation in that way, then you've just handed your enemies a big fat steering wheel. All we have to do to get them to stand down is call them this name. And the name could be different depending on what people you care about, right? Is it racist? Is it misogynist? Is it MAGA? Is it woke? Like the steering wheels could be whatever they are.
Chris Rufo's great at steering wheels.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. On our side. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So Rufo figured out, like, this is part of what he's trying to do, is I'm going to try to use the same kind of tactic. That people won't want to be called this thing. And so they will do things to prove that they're not that. But that depends on a certain societal context where certain terms are good, certain terms are bad. So for us, living in one that is largely hostile, you have to just develop not just a tolerance, but a kind of, this is an anti-fragile. You don't just endure it, but it actually strengthens you to know, like, okay, I'm not the evil thing that they say I am. Like, I'm not infected with some kind of racial supremacy, but I expect that if I'm faithful, I will be called that name. Right. And that's the price of faithfulness, is to be called nasty things. So make sure the nasty things aren't true, and then get on with it, and don't let them steer you.
You mentioned, so going back to, I was going to go back to Shakespeare, but I want to ask another question beforehand. There's an aspect of all of this that we've been talking about that's also deeply religious. Thinking of Wallace again. His wife, recently, there was a clip that resurfaced that she talked about how during the riots, she opened her window. You saw this? Yeah. She opened her window to smell the burning tires. Yeah. And just as a way to empathize with the people. Right. So it's both the empathy, but there's also just, I tweet this, every couple months, just like, we live in deeply religious times, despite every attempt to not make them religious. We're like absurdly religious as a people. What kind of religion is it? If we're just saying it's not just emotions, is it sort of like the Dionysus crazy? Yeah, where you're worshiping yourself. Well, how does that work?
Yeah, so I think that, like, the Dionysian impulse, which is like, so that the contrast between Apollonian religion and Dionysian religion kind of is sort of like buttoned up religion.
Because we think of religion, the secular man thinks of religion as,
lots of rules,
very somber. Yeah. You go to,
Yeah, and usually though, at least in the kind of like the classical Greek vision, it's like there's that, and then they kind of unleash every so now and then they've got to just cut loose. right? And so that you have the sort of Dionysian festival, the Bacchanalian revelry. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So in sort of the modern sense, it's the 2 minutes hate, let it all, vent it, which you can kind of sometimes see when, you know, you have these weird like retreats that people go on where they just like yell.
Right.
And it's like, you just sit there and you go like, oh, you've been working in a cubicle, like in this oppressive, like, what in the world am I even doing environment? And this is your vent. So that principle of we're buttoned up for a certain amount of time and then we cut loose in the Bacchanalian, whether it's, and you could think of this in, you know, the Roman Catholic Church version of this would be like Mardi Gras, right? We're about to enter a season of Lent, so we better just cut loose and absolutely, you know, go crazy for that time. It's actually a perversion of the sort of like biblical Sabbath principle where you work for 6 days and then you rest, celebrate, and are refreshed on the seventh. Like that's how, but none of it is like sort of just unbridled chaos. Right. It's not just pent up release. It's fruitful labor for the good of you, for the glory of God and the good of your people. Like it's fruitful labor, and then enjoy the fruit. Like enjoy the fruit, have the celebration, right? Let the wine flow, cook the big thing of meat, like have the party, take a nap. And like that's, there's a Sabbath version of this. This other thing is what fallen man does, sinful man, where it's like the labor is oppressive, and then the celebration is Dionysus. It's cut loose, and so I do think that we see both sides of that, and I think that you'll actually like. I would expect in some ways that there will be attempts to basically channel some of those passions into more ritualistic ways. I think you even see this kind of now, like some of like the, even during the height of the woke stuff, like the say their name, right? Say George Floyd's name, whatever, was an attempt to kind of ritualize, and it's a perverse Lord's Supper. Right. Where in Lord's Supper, Christians, you know, we remember the Lord by partaking of the body and the blood, right? You know, do this in remembrance of me. And it's like, it's that thing. It's like that same impulse to remember a key moment, and to reflect upon it and to have it sort of strengthen your faith. Right. It's that same sort of thing. It's a religious confession coupled with a remembrance of this kind of like these new religious things, which is also why the calendar becomes such a big deal. It's like the colonization of the calendar, whether it's by the LGBT stuff, like the rainbow calendar, where it's like, for a while, it was like, they just decided June was their month. So they just claimed June. But then you actually like whenever the thing happened in March, where it was Trans Day on Easter.
On Easter, yeah.
And Biden recognized it. And then all of a sudden the news stories came out. Actually, it's basically like, there's like hundreds of days in the year devoted to some aspect of the Rainbow Coalition in various ways. And so it's like the entire, which is again, it's like when the medieval Catholic Church was like, we're going to have a feast day to St. Andrew's cat.
Right.
You know, like it's like, you know, you got the Christmas and Easter and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, and then now this is the feast of St. Andrew's cat. And like, what? Okay, I guess we're going to have another party. And so that colonization of the calendar is about, in the Christian terms, the ancient Greek word for this is paideia, which is about enculturating future citizens. So for Christians, it was citizens of the kingdom of God. But the Greeks did it. You know, good Athenians needed to be paideia'd into Greek culture. And now you have this rainbow paideia, which is basically, we are going to catechize you, and everywhere you go, like when the biblical, in the book of Deuteronomy, there's this famous passage that Christians and Jews often use as sort of like, this is our vision for education, where it's like, speak of them when you wake up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, when you walk beside the way, when you rise up, when you lie down, write them on your wrists, put them on your frontlets before your eyes, on your doorposts. And it's like, there's a version of this that we're living in that's deeply, it's religious in this sense, that it's like, we will speak of it when we drive down Main Street, and when we go to Target, and when we turn on the ball game. And, you know, it's like we're going to put these signposts up everywhere to remind you. So, and the goal is, just like in the biblical vision, it was, you do these things so that your kids will say, what does this mean? What do those stones mean? You know, set up these stones of remembrance, and you know, in time to come, your children will ask, what do those stones mean? And then you'll say, well, we were slaves in the land of Egypt, and we, God brought us out with a mighty hand, and we crossed this river, and we set up those stones to remind us of God's deliverance. So the symbols are designed to provoke questions, which you answer with your story. Okay. Well, that's what the rainbow is in modern religious sensibilities. It's like rainbow everywhere, so that kids go, Mommy, what does the rainbow mean? And that's when, like, you need to say, well, it's a sign. God, it was a sign of God's mercy in the book of Genesis, and it's been hijacked by wicked people who want to rebel against God. That's what the rainbow means. So you just use it to catechize your kids.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned George Floyd as a sort of thwarting of the Lord's Supper. There was what actually made me realize that the deeply religious nature of these times, whereas a while back during the lockdowns, there was some article that talked about how in Germany, people who weren't fully vaccinated and boosted for COVID couldn't access the assisted suicide program. And I was like, this is, you can't partake of the supper unless you're baptized.
Right.
It's literally this.
Yeah, fixing the table.
But in the most demonic sort of reversal, where you're like, are you fully baptized with the vaccines?
Yes.
Then you can't partake. If you are, then you can partake the table of death.
It's crazy. That's absolutely right. And it's where, again, like the Bible does give just these really penetrating analyses of this sort of thing. So like in the book of Romans, which is Paul's sort of great letter about what the Christian vision of reality is, the gospel is, it opens with this description of like what happens to not just individuals, but to societies when they refuse to honor God as God and give thanks. So he's like, that's the fundamental thing. You don't honor God as God. You don't give thanks to him. And then as a result, it says, God gives you over to a depraved mind. It gives you over to debased desires. So sexual, it like immediately goes to sort of sexual disorder. So sexual immorality, unnatural desires, like that's a part of it. And then from there, it's then all manner of evil. And in the list, it's everything from malice and envy and bitterness to disobedience to parents and cruelty, faithlessness, heartlessness, cruel, all of these sort of things. And it's like all of that flows downstream from, if you don't acknowledge God, if you don't worship him and serve him, then there will be a big vacuum, and you will put something else there.
You don't just stop worshiping.
You don't just stop worshiping, right? Like you're just like it. We are indelibly religious creatures because that's how God made us. So if you don't worship the living God, you'll worship a false God, and you will. If you don't have faithful religion, you'll have demented religion, right? Which is what we see, and it's a tricky thing because it's not. In the modern society, it's an attempt to kind of invent new ones, which end up looking, eerily similar to the old ones, right? Where you can see that they're parodies or they're attempted recoveries of whether it's paganism or kind of like all the trappings of paganism, but like with different deities, different saints.
Yeah. How does this all map to, especially the passion stuff? How does it map to the kind of classical understanding of masculinity and masculine virtues and feminine virtues? I'm specifically thinking of, so recently there was a tweet from a very prominent Silicon Valley investor. His name is Naval Ravikant, and I think I'll summarize it in this way, but he basically said something like the cultural battle comes down to the war between the masculine men and the feminine women, and the masculine women and the feminine men. Yeah. Empathy strikes me as, Wolf is an empathetic leader. Yeah. But it's sort of a feminine-ish virtue of sorts. How does it all square together?
So the way to think about virtues often is that virtues are virtues. Men and women are both called to them. But because we're men and women, they're going to be sort of inflected with that masculinity and femininity, this is why, dads should be tender with their kids, but it's a masculine tenderness, which is different than a feminine tenderness. Like, so when dad's comfort and mom's comfort will look different. Both of them could be legitimately called comfort. You fell down, but dad is going to orient to that in a different way. And he's going to provide something to the kid. So, this is why, dad's roughhouse with kids, because it's about building security and safety. Like there's a sense of like, risk is good. And I'm going to help you. I'm going to throw you in the air and you're going to feel the fear, but you need to know I've got you. Right. And so whereas mom's never going to do that. She's never going to just be like, I'm going to just throw this baby. See, can he hit the, like if he can touch the roof, can you touch the roof? Mom's never going to do that, but she's going to provide something different. Right. What happens like what's happened in our society is that like those masculine virtues, that masculine inflection of those virtues has been pathologized. Toxic masculinity. This is, and it's not toxic. It's like, it's not all toxic. It's just masculinity is regarded as toxic, which means that men are regarded as basically inferior women, right? Which there could be societies and have been societies where it was reversed and women were just regarded as defective men, right? Like that's actually like possible. We don't live in that one. And so,
why do you think that is?
Like, why don't we live in one of those?
Why is it a sort of why would we steer in this direction?
This is like, somebody's probably written something way better on this. My sort of rough notion is that the modern geopolitical order with sort of American hegemony post World War II, and before that, even kind of like British hegemony, there's a couple hundred years enlightenment with technological improvement, basically created a stable enough order that, like global order, that allowed, in some ways, for societies to operate as households
for a period of time.
Yeah. So, like, in other words, things that would have been unthinkable in a context in which your little fiefdom, your little kingdom, is threatened on all sides by other kingdoms, and you could be absorbed if you don't watch it. Like the need for masculine virtues, drawing lines, guarding boundaries, manning perimeters, and then cultivating internally the kinds of virtues that would be necessary for flourishing. For flourishing. Right. Like those are sort of like, if you don't have those, you die. So instead, what we have, and I think this is what you see kind of in Europe, this would be my like rough hypothesis, is as America sort of took on world policemen, those nations, like all of their military spending went down, and they started funneling that money to health and human services or whatever. Exactly. And so, and I remember it may have been an old like Mark Stein column that just kind of stuck in my head from like a decade ago or something. And it's basically like, in those countries, the Secretary of Defense position is the stepping stone on the way to where the real power is. Right. So like if you want is to be Secretary of Defense is like, okay, that's like, if you do get at that, you might get promoted to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. Right. Or the Minister of Transportation or some other thing like that, the Minister of, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Like that's
higher than
that's higher. But the only reason that works is it's essentially what has happened is all of the boundary setting of building the walls that's the U.S. military.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And then it allows for this to function the way a household was. So like in an ancient household, you think about a biblical household, it's the husband's in the city gates with the elders of the land, and his wife is not idle at home. She's not barefoot in the kitchen. Like she's working her fingers to the bone, providing things for her household. She's
investing. She's buying land.
Yeah, she's buying land. Right. She's a real estate. She's like, hey, I can take this wool and flax and I can make it into this fabric and I can sell it and make a profit and I can enlarge our household. Like Chris Wiley has said that if you took the Proverbs 31 woman, which is sort of the, representative godly woman in the Bible, and if you put her in the contemporary world, she'd basically be the vice president of a mid-sized corporation. Like given the kinds of responsibilities that she's exercising as the sort of household manager of this large household. So basically, I think what's happened is society as a whole has become like that, which then opens up possibilities for women to operate in certain roles, CEOs of companies and things like that, usually not as founders. Usually not as the one who gets it off the ground, but as the one who it gets handed off to. But then over time, it kind of hollows out the inside, right? Because the virtues that were necessary to build the thing, both the society and those individual institutions, have been neglected and are now threats, right? So this is the thing, is that women, male aggression, and I don't just mean like actual violence, but just the intensity of masculine, the go-getter, get-em attitude, the direct speech is a threat to women and has to be sort of neutered in order for men and women. So it
seems like that's where the perfect blend between like bureaucracy and feminism in a way.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a beautiful match.
Right, because women will use soft power, but it's about enlisting. It's about getting getting other men to police other men. Right. And so the bureaucracy is about having sort of the right to enlist the good men, right, to take care of the bad men. Right. And so that bureaucracy is sort of what enables that efficiency. And And so you then end up losing, men either sort of go their own way thing, right? And just check out. I'm going to go play. If I can't really build something, and if I can't really be fruitful by, marrying someone and having a household, then I'll just do fake love with porn, and I'll do fake war with Call of Duty, right? So I'll just fake it. And so they'll just check out and abdicate and let the thing run on its own for a while. But eventually the bill comes due. And right now, like the actual challenge is that it's hollowed out to the point that, like, to face an actual real threat, if the barbarians actually started to come over the walls, like, do we have the resources? So this is where I think, Christians ought to be devoting energy to cultivating healthy communities where men lead, where men establish boundaries, lay foundations, do the hard things, take responsibility, which then enables women to operate as God intended them to operate, in beautifying, glorifying, making fruitful. Like, women are the agents of fruitfulness in the biblical picture. Like, there's a literal version of that where, like, the husband plants his seed and the wife is the garden that bears the fruit in childbearing. And that's sort of an image of the way lots of things work in terms of how the sexes should operate. But it requires both inflections of virtues. You have to have both masculine courage, which is that risk-taking, daring sort of thing. And then you have to have a feminine form of courage, which is, in the biblical picture, the feminine courage is the one that says, I can follow a fallible man. Like Sarah, like Abraham in the biblical story, Abram comes home and says, hey, God told me that we're going to go. We're supposed to leave. And Sarah's like, well, where are we going? He's like, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? He didn't tell me that. He just said, the land he's going to show us. But where is it? I don't know. But we got to go. So pack up the stuff. That's terrifying for a wife to be told, hey, you just got to go. And so the Bible says she did not fear anything that was frightening. She said, all right, I'm going. Right? So that's a feminine form of courage, but it's a different kind of courage than the courage of David, who is like facing down Goliath and is like this, that's a different, like,
purely physical.
It's a physical, martial, aggressive, honor. You've defied the name of my God, and that matters to me in a certain kind of way. The honor of God, my God, and my people is at stake in your insults, and you need to answer for your words. And so I will go into battle even though I'm outsized. Like, that kind of masculine courage is a great, glorious thing, but so is the feminine version. So you need both, but if you pathologize one and say, this is a threat to that, right? Masculine courage,
in totality,
always and everywhere, right, needs to be neutered, medicated, right? Castrated, then you end up with none of it, right? This is the C.S. Lewis. This is where we go back to C.S. Lewis, right? We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. It's like, for him was a metaphor. At the time it was a metaphor. Somebody else decided, maybe we should try that. It's like, let's actually physically try to castrate, and then say, let's have a fruitful society.
Well, that is our time for today.
Yeah.
Joe, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.